merely a cover-up. As Ms. Gustafsson argued, Gotovina expected his orders to fail. The absurdity of this case is demonstrated by paragraph 125 of the prosecution brief, where it is argued that in issuing his attack order, and I quote, Gotovina knew that his superficial instructions to prevent looting and burning and generic references to the Geneva Conventions were manifestly inadequate measures to prevent these crimes in the circumstances. End of quote. Presumably, the prosecution view is that humanitarian law requires military commanders to issue exhaustive scholarly dissertations on the Geneva Conventions. Only then could orders to protect civilians qualify as necessary and reasonable measures. The argument is plainly ridiculous. The prosecution would further maintain that General Gotovina's scathing condemnation of drinking and looting among soldiers that he referred to as barbarians was all a cover-up. Presumably, his anger at his subordinates was meant to encourage undisciplined conduct among his troops on the eve of his next war with Ratko Mladic in Bosnia. To argue that this is the only reasonable inference that can be drawn is simply ridiculous. It is also astonishing that Ms. Gustafsson would state that there is no difference between the duties of operational commanders and other commanders in disregard of the authorities in paragraphs 647 to 649 of our brief. In the landmark High Command trial, the U.S. military tribunal recognized, even with respect to monstrous Nazi crimes, that an operational commander such as General Wilhelm von Lieb had the right to leave administrative duties in occupied territories to his rear to his subordinate commanders and to assume that they would see to their proper execution. Given the radically different context of Nazi crimes in Operation Storms, General Gotovina should surely deserve no less than General von Lieb. In this regard, and in closing, I must express my appreciation for Ms. Gustafsson's analogy to what parents or authority figures should do when their orders are disregarded. As a father of two naughty children, Mr. President, I've issued repeated orders against mischief, but now that I'm in The Hague pleading before this chamber, I rest assured that the implementation of those orders is the responsibility of others back in Montreal. And our expectation should be no different with respect to General Gotovina, who had to assume that as operational commander of 30,000 soldiers responsible for 2 theaters of war in Croatia and Bosnia, having done his utmost to instill discipline and professionalism among his soldiers in exceedingly difficult wartime circumstances, that he could issue orders and assume that others would see to the proper execution. The prosecution has repeatedly asked this trial chamber to look at the totality of the evidence in arriving at its conclusion. We welcome this invitation because when the overall circumstances of the war are considered, General Gotovina's efforts to establish a disciplined and professional army while confronted with a ruthless enemy that had ethnically cleansed and occupied a third of Croatia, an enemy that regularly bombed its cities and towns with impunity, to consider that in the face of such a grave and imminent peril, in the shadow of Srebrenica and the threatened fall of Bihać to yet another genocide, if the totality of these circumstances are considered, the argument that he failed to take necessary and reasonable measures cannot possibly be the only reasonable inference under any realistic view of humanitarian law.
Mr. Akhavan, you have to, I said I would be strict. Apparently you...
I've been handed a note, sir, that the Markac team has also given me an additional 5 minutes, and I've literally less than that to conclude my submissions.
Yes, what you're actually doing, you just, although at a higher speed, continue to read what you have prepared. If you have limited time, you have to adapt your situation and perhaps take out some of the rhetorics, whether, for example, whether it's the conspiracy of the decade or the century is not really very convincing for the chamber. But it's up to you to use your time. But if you just continue to do what you are doing, more or less ignoring, you've got 3 minutes left. Please proceed.
General Gotovina has spent almost 5 years of his life in prison on charges that are wholly without merit. He is a courageous and honorable soldier to whom we owe a debt of gratitude. Gratitude for risking his life to defeat those that inflicted the scourge of ethnic cleansing on the peoples of former Yugoslavia. Gratitude for making it possible for this tribunal to arrest those most responsible for such unspeakable atrocities. Amidst the horrifying realities of the war that he fought, and by any reasonable measure of humanitarian law, justice demands that he be declared innocent of the baseless accusations against him. In conclusion, Mr. President, honorable members of the Chamber, we respectfully submit that this trial chamber should enter a judgment of acquittal for General Gotovina on all counts of the indictment. I thank you for your patience and attention. That concludes my submissions.
Thank you, Mr. Akkerman. Who's next in line? Is the Chairman of Defense.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Mr. Kay, I don't have to remind you that you shouldn't speak too quickly, but I still would expect you and the Markets Defense to...
We just have some furniture arrangements to deal with, Your Honour. Okay.
Mr. Kay, it is my intention to have a break starting in 20 minutes from now, a break of then 20 minutes again until 1:45. If you would find a more appropriate moment, please feel free within certain limits to choose that moment.
I'm grateful to Your Honour. Your Honour, this is the closing argument on behalf of Ivan Chermak. At a stage in the case, it having started in March 2008 with the opening of the prosecution, calling of witnesses, and then a considerable period of time later, the closing arguments to be presented. And we're able to look back through the corridor of that time and take an assessment of what was said the day Mr. Teager opened the case, what had been written in an indictment before the opening of the case, what had been written in a pre-trial brief by the prosecution, the allegations that they were to make, and we look back now to see whether they have been proved or not. What has changed? Whether there's been any substance to support those allegations. At the start of the trial, they were relying upon statements taken in the English language, Croatian witnesses not having statements in their own language, witnesses who had made statements subsequently came into court and were accountable in a trial for what they had said, and an examination of what they had said to investigators took place. And during that period of time there were some telling moments. I'm just going to identify 4 because they concern the Chermak case, and they were telling moments that show that the case that was to be presented was not the case that came about in fact. And they showed a prosecution that was on the run with its allegations. It had started with broad allegations of General Cermak being in command of umpteen divisions of the split military district. It had started with allegations of him being in command and control of everything that moved in and around Canine and Sector South. Is that where they have come to, that same position when Mr. Carrier addressed you yesterday? Did he have that convincing confidence about a man who'd proved his case? Looking at the final brief, when you read it, analyse the allegations that have been made, look at the footnotes, not ours, but look at the prosecution footnotes and see what is cited in support. Are those citations correct, reflect what has been written in the main document, or false? And I'll use that word because that's a word that came up in the prosecution final brief about evidence from the Cermak defence. It's not a word I would generally use in court, but it was one we took exception to in the final brief from the prosecutor, and we heard it again yesterday. But let no one doubt we will meet fire with fire. But those telling moments, let's just have a look at those. When General Lausitz was to give evidence before this court, the night before he met the prosecution investigator. He was furtively handed a brown envelope. I don't know whether it was furtive or not, but it sounded like it from his description. And in that envelope were documents. And one of those documents was the exhibit D34, the organisational order of 1993 concerning garrisons. This was a document that had not been mentioned by Mr. Lausitz